Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar, Powering Forward, Exploring the Future of Offshore Wind Energy in Ireland. The west coast of Europe has some of the best wind potential in the world, and with Ireland with the biggest maritime territory of the EU and the highest wind speeds, we're probably best positioned to take advantage. So today we want to look at where that potential is. It's estimated that we've approximately 7 times our own current usage of electricity in potential to produce off the coast of Ireland. So we want to look at, if you like, what are the roadblocks that have to be overcome to make this happen? And what are the potential uses that we can use that electricity for? Is it to export electricity to other parts of Europe, or is it to convert it into alternative fuels like hydrogen or ammonia? Or how also, which is very important, how can local communities benefit from this and ensure that they're not left out or left behind in relation to the development of this wind energy strategy for the future? I'm lucky to be joined here today by 4 experts in the area. We've Elaine O'Connell from DG Energy in the European Commission, who's going to talk to us about the EU strategy on offshore renewable energy. We've David Kiley from consulting engineering firm Jennings, O'Donovan and Partners, who look at the future potential uses of the electricity. Daniel Brown also, who will, from Rowan Group Renewables, who will speak to us about the infrastructure issues and other blockages, if you like, in the system. And finally, we'll have Niall Goodwin, who'll look at it, who's from Wind Energy Ireland, who will look at it from the context of, if you like, the strategy of how we can develop it from an Irish perspective. We will also be joined later by my colleague Sean Kelly, who equally has a keen interest in this area. So as you know, if you've attended any of our previous webinars, we like to keep them fairly tight. We'll give each of the speakers essentially 5 minutes to make their opening remarks, and then we want to save the bulk of the event for questions from the audience. So at that stage, if you like, we'll really get into the meat of the issues. So without any further ado, I'll pass you over to Elaine O'Connell. Elaine.
Thanks very much, Colm. And I'm very happy to be here today. I think it's a very timely event. As some of you might know, the European Commission published an offshore renewable energy strategy in November 2020. And since then, we've been working to work on all of the actions that have been set out there. And I think many of the contributors today will be touching on some of the bottlenecks and some of the challenges that we're also trying to address from a high level at the EU, and then to engage member states and industry and communities in that. So maybe if we just move quickly to the first slide. If we can move to this slide. And this is really just to show how the renewables ambition in the EU has changed over the last number of years. So we already had quite ambitious targets in the 2018 revision of the Renewable Energy Directive. But now, since last summer, we've also put on the table the Fit for 55 package. And you can see the huge increase that's going to be needed in renewable energy, and a huge increase in efforts as well needed to achieve these targets. Already in 2018, these were seen as being quite ambitious, and now we're proposing to go even higher and meet our ambition of being climate neutral by 2050. And then on the next slide, so what does that mean for electricity, and what does that mean for Europe? So we saw already on the slide before the 38 to 40% ambition for renewable energy. But when you translate that into renewable electricity, that means about 65% of our energy coming from renewable electricity by 2030, and 85% or more by 2050. And I think I won't spend too long on this slide, but just to say that there are many issues here that we need to look at. So, of course, offshore wind has huge potential, and it's one of the most developed forms of energy. But there are also other technologies that are very, very promising and that are also supported by the offshore strategy. The high-level target is to have 60 gigawatts of wind by 2030 in the EU and 1 gigawatt of ocean energy. Now, there are many areas as well around the EU where Ireland is a bit of a different, has a different characteristic in that it doesn't necessarily share sea basins so closely with other countries, but where we see sea basins like the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, that also requires a lot of additional cooperation. Now, of course, Ireland itself is also involved in the North Sea's energy cooperation and is playing a role there in that group to try roll out offshore wind and other renewable technologies. There are many elements that will need to come together. especially when you consider the land uses. So or not the land use, the maritime space use, I should say. A lot of the sea is already, a lot of the area is already dedicated for certain uses, like transport. There are international shipping lanes, for tourism, for the Natura 2000 areas, for fisheries, for defense. And then quite often what's left over is given to offshore wind. So we really need to start to consider multi-use and thinking about this in the round if we're going to reach our targets. And then on the next slide, I won't spend too long on this one, but it talks about the different types of technology that we have. So if we could move to the next slide. So what we see actually is that there's quite a lot of technologies in the pipeline now. At the moment at commercial, it's mostly the fixed bottom offshore wind, but there are many other elements that are a bit earlier along in the development, but there are also areas where we see a lot of potential and also a lot of job potential. I think it's worth mentioning that we've seen in the sectors for green energy, we've seen those sectors grow more than the average economy over the last number of years. And I think that's a really important message. This green transition can also drive jobs and growth. And so where do we need to get to? And then on the next slide, I put a few numbers there about our high level objectives. So we already talked about the offshore wind objective, but of course there's also targets in there for ocean energy, and we expect we hope for up to 40 gigawatts to come by 2050 in that area. So the purpose of the offshore strategy was really to set ambitious targets and encourage public and private investments. We'll need all sectors of the economy to work together in order to reach our targets. And we also need to enable regions to work together more efficiently. You can see the numbers there, about 800 billion euro of investment is needed by 2050. And then on the next slide, this comes back to the point about the potential for jobs and growth. So although there's quite significant potential in Ireland and other coastal states for offshore energy, this is not just a strategy for the coastal member states. This is also a strategy for the whole EU. The supply chain in the EU is quite well developed, and we see huge potential also for landlocked countries to really boost growth and boost jobs through the green transition. And so the next slide explains that there's 3 key areas that the offshore strategy focuses on: maritime spatial planning, the grid and market framework, and also the supply chain and the jobs and research and innovation. And then on the next slide, I tried to put the entire offshore strategy on one slide. So there's quite a lot in there. And in relation to all of these areas, we have various different action items taking place at EU level, and we're following up on each and every one of these. So what I would like to maybe make clear today is that this event is very timely, that the strategy that we're working on at EU level is fully aligned with all of the work that's taking place as well in Ireland on this topic. Colm already mentioned that 80% of our electricity in Ireland, we have a target to reach that from renewable electricity by 2030. And I think this strategy can really help. And then on the last slide, just wanted to highlight again that we really see this as a European story that every member state can benefit from. But of course, we have a lot of work to do, and we need to make sure that we can ensure the multi-use of the sea space, and also that we start thinking more about integrated planning. And I'm sure this will come up today quite a lot in the event. We need joint member state commitments for renewable electricity per sea basin. We need everything to be integrated into the 10-year network development plans. And I think what was also really great, we need to involve communities more, and we need to make sure that the public is involved in this and that we keep the public support and keep the public on board. I was very pleased to see the initiative this week between AirGrid Friends of the Earth and the Renewable Grids Initiative, in which they, for the next 3 years, are going to start a dialogue and start an initiative to engage the public and customers and consumers of electricity in a dialogue about what the bottlenecks and the challenges are to the deployment of renewable electricity. I think we need to see more of this. We need public support, and we need to make sure that people understand the challenges, the issues, and what we can do to solve them. And so with that, I leave it here. It was a quick whistle stop tour through the offshore renewable energy strategy, but everything is online and available on the DG Energy website in case you want to read a bit more about it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elaine. As you say, a whistle-stop tour, but I'm sure we'll get into the detail of it a little later on. And I think that's the whole idea. I think we get greater engagement if we give more time to get questions afterwards. So just on that point, if people can put their questions into the chat, we'll pick them up. And just so people who aren't aware, typically we'll ask the questions here. If you put them in the chat, we'll put them to the panelists. So just it's smoother and quicker. So look, without further ado, I'll move on to David Kiley. David, as I said, is a consulting engineer firm, Jennings O'Donovan and Partners. So David is very much going to look at, if we generate all this electricity, how can we best use it? And I'll just pass over to David to take you further.
Thank you, Colin, and good afternoon, everyone. So offshore wind really is a global scale industry, and we need it to become carbon neutral. And as the industry develops and grows, as Elaine said, there is going to be a need for integrated energy networks and integrated planning systems throughout Europe and throughout the world in some areas. And in Europe, for example, there's a lot of discussion on at the moment about the 10E trans-energy networks for electricity. So all of that has to emerge as policy. So just moving on then to the next slide, Colin alluded to Ireland's maritime area, and the red line there shows the extent of it, and it's about 10 times our land mass. So that gives an idea of what our potential might be. Now, not all that area is obviously open or fair game. It is subject to marine spatial planning. There will be marine protected areas, Natura 2000 sites, shipping lanes, fisheries, and bird migratory routes. So there's a lot of competing interests in that water. Now, various studies have suggested that we might be able to develop something like 85 gigawatts within that area. And our own government have a target of 30 gigawatts of, say, floating offshore wind within that area by 2050. So I might just go on to the next slide. So looking at the areas in Ireland that are currently of interest for mainly fixed bottom offshore wind, those are the ones in red. So about 8 of those wind farms will probably move on and be developed hopefully by 2030. Back about 15 years ago, there was a moratorium put on the system of dealing with these applications through the foreshore lease process. And since then, not an awful lot has happened, but various projects that were either through the process or in the process, are being allowed, will be the first to be developed. And we can come back to specific ones later if need be. But some of those will be developed up to 2030, and some will be developed afterwards. And then there's obviously the potential for floating wind off the southwest and west and northwest coast. So we might just go on to the next slide. So our fuel mix at any one time and our energy demand, our primary energy demand is a mix, is roughly a third between heat, transport and electricity. So Wind Energy Ireland and Moray, who are based in UCC, did a very comprehensive study early this year and looked at the inputs and outputs to our electricity system now and in the future. So now you can see that, say, on the left-hand side of that particular graphic, oil and gas make up the bulk of our electricity system, and renewables, when you summarize them in the graphic at the bottom, make up 12%, and they feed into the various demands. So if we move on to the next slide, you'll see how that might change by 2050, in that wind will make up the bulk of it, with bioenergy and other then following behind, and also solar. And so effectively, we'll see a big move. But what we do notice as well is when we compare the primary energy usage with the previous slide, our total primary energy usage comes down a bit because we're going to be using it more efficiently. So moving on again, we'll see that if we just focus on the left hand of that particular slide, we'll see that, you know, the overall mix of generation is gas, wind, some coal at the moment, and some other renewables. And then we'll see as it goes towards 2050, it's dominated by wind. There will be solar as well, and the other bioenergy renewables. So if we move on then to what the offshore wind, the next slide is the offshore wind capacity that we might need ourselves in Ireland for 2050, and deriving that from the last slide, the installed capacity would be about 21 gigawatts. And if you take that 8 gigawatts of total wind is for onshore wind, that's about 13 gigawatts of offshore wind. And Wind Energy Ireland, in their survey of 2021, project that 27 projects could deliver 15 to 20 gigawatts of installed capacity. And that would equate to about 1,083 turbines at 12 megawatts each. So how might we use that then? So moving on to say, scenario, if we go on to the next slide, rail electrification could be one particular scenario. So again, using figures that are available from Sustainable Energy Ireland and working through the maths, we would see that about 300 megawatts of installed offshore wind would be suitable to run the whole rail system electrically. So that would be about 25 of the bigger 12 megawatt turbines that are being contemplated nowadays. And then if you look at cars, for example, on the next slide, please. And you look at the number of vehicles and cars that we have on our roads at the moment. And again, we would need 340 big 12 megawatt turbines to run our fleet of cars. So then just moving on very slightly, I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but this is our electricity grid. It's pretty poor at the moment. There's only 2 big motorways there in terms of electricity. Those are the red lines. And we will need to develop that further to be able to use more electricity and get it distributed to the users. And in the context of Europe, obviously, if we move on, please, next slide. If we have a potential for something like 85 gigawatts of offshore wind off our coast, and we're only using 23, what do we do with the balance? Do we become part of a European network? And if so, you know, the European supergrid might become a reality. There are other ways that we could, if we move on to the next slide, there are other ways that we can use offshore wind. We can use hydrogen. So basically take seawater, desalinate it, put it through an electrolyzer, generate hydrogen, and we can use that for mobility or for industry, or inject it into the gas grid. So I suppose that's it in a snapshot. There's a lot of policy to be put in place, both nationally and internationally, to make all this happen. Offshore wind, I believe, is absolutely necessary on a global scale to achieve carbon neutrality. And as a result of that, it has it can change the world in a geopolitical way when you see there won't be a dependence on Middle East oil. So yeah, that's something for us all to think about. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to questions.
Thanks, David. And I think that is, your last point is very relevant in the current time, given the price of oil and gas and everything, that if we can in some way make ourselves less dependent on, if you like, the gas pipeline from Russia, it surely is something important for us strategically for our future. So look, moving on to Daniel Brown, Rowan Group Renewables, who will speak to us a little bit. He's based in Killybegs, so he'll speak to us a little bit, I suppose, about the infrastructure requirements and indeed some of the bottlenecks that's in the system. So over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Colin, and I'll try and keep on point time-wise. After the success of our company founders in the involvement of the Codling project, which is a fixed bottom 1.5 gigawatt project in the Irish Sea, the focus of the company has moved towards the West Coast and the floating wind opportunity, or flow as it's known. We understand the ports are going to play a crucial role in the deployment and success of floating offshore wind. But here's what we have to consider as a country and to get it done. When projects assess the suitability of a site, there are a number of things they will review, and high on the list is deployment. Where is this going to get built from? Where is this going to be managed from? To ensure the financial viability of projects, they're going to have to be able to be deployed, managed, and maintained efficiently and in a streamlined way. Right now, flow technology is proven. But to achieve the expected drop in the levelized cost of energy, or LCOE, which is required to see full-scale deployment of projects at gigawatt scale, it's crucial that we've got a really streamlined supply chain across the west coast of Ireland that stands ready to be able to deploy these projects. And here's the most recent real-world example that we can look to. The 50 megawatt Kincardine floating offshore wind farm is now fully operational off the coast of Scotland in waters of up to 80 meters in depth. It's currently the largest floating wind farm in the world, and that's just 50 megawatts. The project consists of 5 Vestas turbines, each one at 9.5 megawatts, and then there's a 2 megawatt machine. They're installed on semi-submersible wind float platforms designed by Principal Power, and I'm delighted to say their Chief Technical Officer is Cian Conroy, is Irish-based, proud Oranmore man. But despite the rich oil and gas infrastructure and the experience in fixed-bottom offshore wind on the east coast of the UK and in Scotland, the 5 floating foundations for this project were manufactured by Navantia in Spain, towed to Rotterdam, where the turbines were put on to the bases, and then towed to Scotland. So the Scottish coast completely missed out on an opportunity. Now, this was not the preferred outcome for deployment, but it was selected as it was the most expedient way to just simply get the job done. The Irish programme for government sets out an ambition of 30 gigawatts of floating wind off the west coast. Industry believes, and as David has referenced, that ambition could be 70 to 90 gigawatts. Projects off the west coast, when they're at that scale, are going to be 500 megawatts to a gigawatt in terms of scale. So even if we envisage a scenario, nearly a worst case scenario, where turbines and wind floats are manufactured elsewhere and simply towed to ports for marshalling and assembly before deployment off the west coast, there are certain efficiencies that are going to have to be achieved. One single 500 megawatt project consisting 50 turbines based on today's technology. And let's put that in context. That's equivalent to 25% of all onshore wind currently in Ireland. That's one 500 megawatt project. That's going to need to be deployed in one construction season to get the best value out of the installation crews, vessels, and infrastructure. The industry has already cited the need to achieve a minimum deployment scale of 3 turbines a week. That's 17 weeks of workable weather conditions off the west coast of Ireland, essentially one summer or 1 year to deploy one 500 megawatt project. And put it into context, these 50 turbines, each one of them would be the scale of the Eiffel Tower. So for any of the ports in Ireland, and currently there are really only 4 that would have the draft and the depth, etc., Killybegs, Foynes Cove and Belfast, that would really be able to handle projects of that scale. They have the natural attributes. Projects, now Galway has got significant plans via land reclamation and additional pier infrastructure to become part of the solution. But if it takes one full summer or one full year for one port to deploy 500 megawatt projects, you can very quickly see how we'll have a serious bottleneck in deployment with even 30 gigawatts, taking decades to deploy, leading to projects being manufactured and assembled elsewhere and simply towed into position off the coast of Ireland. For Ireland Inc. and the EU in general to maximise the benefit from Ireland's marine renewable resource, we're going to need to have a coordinated approach between all the ports along the west coast, so developers see one unified, streamlined solution to assemble and deploy projects when they look back to shore. We need to invest in ports, of that there is no doubt. Wet storage, working areas, pier side, deep drafts, open ocean access, 24-hour working days, cranes, marine engineering skills. We know what we need to do. But equally, more importantly, we need to think of our ports not as islands, but as one necklace of a solution along the West Coast. Ireland has these ports I've name checked. Denmark has 26 similar ports. If we want to be at the races, we need to get up and start working now. The rural TDs this week had a motion on offshore renewables in the Doyle, and they've already identified this risk of Ireland's wind resource being developed by ports in the UK, Scotland, and elsewhere. There's now further delays expected to the Marine Area Regulatory Authority formation, or MARA, as it's been called. That's now pushed out to 2023. And there are serious consequences about grid capacity and moving electrons from the West Coast to Central Europe. There is enough challenges, delays, and bottlenecks ahead of us. We cannot allow a coordinated investment strategy in our ports to be a further bottleneck. The Department of Transport, finally, are currently doing a review of port requirements in light of the renewable opportunity. That's due to be released imminently. It's welcome, but it needs to look at all the ports and consider the scale of the opportunity and how we can maximize the benefit, and also how it could be missed if we don't act now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I think that sums it up. Like, the acting now is what's needed, or others maybe can step in and do it for us, and that'd be an awful loss to the Irish economy. And I think that's I suppose the focus of why the urgency is current, and why we need to see what the issues are and move them on. Our last speaker before we go to the Q&A, and I would remind people again, put your question in. We have a number of questions in already, but we'd like to get a few more. But our last speaker is Niall Goodwin from Wind Energy Ireland. Now, Wind Energy Ireland are very much the, if you like, the industry representative body who are working with all stakeholders in the industry. And I suppose Niall will give us an overview of where we're at from a legislative perspective, I suppose, or what next steps are. Over to you, Niall.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much, MVP Markey, for the invitation to participate in today's webinar. And look, delighted to see the level of interest and this is happening, and the attendees here today. You know, this is a sector that's set to grow rapidly in the coming years, both due to government ambition and, I suppose, the phenomenal renewable resource that we have offshore in Ireland. And maybe just to go on to my first slide there, to give a bit of background, we can start with the former. You know, the 2020 programme for government, it ushered in a level of renewable energy ambition beyond anything we'd seen previously in Ireland. The document set out, as we've mentioned already, the 5 gigawatt offshore wind target by 2030, alongside a longer term 30 gigawatt target for the deployment of floating wind off our Atlantic coast. You know, this step up in ambition, it meant that there was obviously a need to revise Ireland's climate action plan that you can see on there. And last month, government published a new version, setting out the onshore and offshore capacity targets of 8 gigawatts and 5 gigawatts respectively, and enshrining that 80% RES-E target. You know, that's so important to the development of the industry. But in addition to that, you know, it set out the challenge that we need to reduce power sector emissions from 10 million tonnes or so we have today down to a level of between 2 and 4 million tonnes, which is going to be a massive ask. And you know, offshore wind is going to be a really crucial part of that, alongside other technologies such as long duration storage and green hydrogen, to drive us towards that target. So just to move on to the next slide there, and I suppose there are major policy challenges associated with achieving this level of ambition. But I think the good news that I can give you this morning is that the pipeline of projects to deliver it is very much there. So earlier in the year, government launched the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Bill. This set out that we as a country need to reduce our emissions as a country from around 60 million tonnes a year to around half of that, 30 million tonnes by 2030. That means we need to remove 30 million tonnes of CO2 every year from society. Electricity is responsible for around 10 million tonnes of that. And if we were to get this down over the next 10 years and reduce it down to that 2 million tonnes figure, as I mentioned, or so, you know, offshore wind has an important role. So as David mentioned, every year, Wind Energy Ireland carries out a survey of its members to get a clear picture of that pipeline of projects, both onshore and offshore. And in the survey we concluded earlier this year, we found that there's about 20 gigawatts of offshore wind projects in development off our coast at the moment. Onto the next slide, you can see that I break that down a little bit. So the majority is on the East Coast. That includes the phase 1 projects. That's 13 that that's the 6 phase 1 projects, but then that's part of a wider group of 13 projects that are in various stages of development off the East Coast that will be looking to connect between now and 2030. We also have a growing number of projects developing off our southern and western coasts of Ireland, as you can see on the slide there. In total, that's about 12 gigawatts off these coasts. And as David mentioned, we're increasingly seeing, more and more floating offshore wind projects, with 8 projects now off the southern and western coasts looking to connect as part of the phase 2 grouping. Moving on to my next slide, and I suppose on that, a point I really want to get across in this afternoon's webinar is, just how crucial that group of 6 phase 1 projects are. You can see on screen the kind of timelines of the expected delivery for phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 will be the start of how we build our offshore sector. In the coming months, we really need to bring forward as many of the phase 1 projects into the planning system as possible, starting with their maritime area consents as early as possible next year, so that they can compete in the first offshore auction, which we expect, late in 2022. And then at the same time, we need to have a clear pathway for how we're going to deliver the phase 2 group of projects. So the phase 1 projects will be the first ones to compete in the auction. Then the phase 2 projects will come after that. So how will we define a phase 2 project? When will the auction, the ORES 2, take place? And when will they enter into the planning process? These are things that need to be clarified as early as possible. And we do expect that the government will consult on this in the coming weeks. This will be really important to determine what comes next. Both phase 1 and phase 2 projects are critical and needed to deliver that 5 gigawatt target. On to my next slide. And I suppose a key point to get across as well is that time is running out. In September, at our offshore conference, we launched a short publication that you can see on screen, 12 months to deliver offshore wind energy. And that sets out the 7 actions we need to see over what was then the next 12 months. That's now shortened. We're now almost 3 months on from that to deliver our 5 gigawatt target. I'll take you briefly through some of them. So number 1 there, you see foreshore licenses. So in Q1 of next year, as early as possible, we need to ensure that there's enough foreshore licenses delivered to get us to that 5 gigawatts. There will be attrition in the planning system. There will be projects that are unsuccessful in the auction. Someone has to be unsuccessful in an auction. So the first step the projects need to take is to get a foreshore license so they can carry out their 2 years of environmental surveys, so they can then enter into the planning system. If we don't have enough of these handed out, we won't have enough projects to meet the target. Now, there has been progress in that in recent months, and that's very welcome. On resourcing, critical. We need to see more people in this sector. Government departments need to be resourced up, and we also need to see more people in our planning system. On board Planola needs to be properly resourced so that we can get these projects moving through the system when they eventually go into it. The next point there, the auctions on RES. So DEC are currently working on the terms and conditions of the first offshore auction. And I have to say the team there has been really, really excellent and have engaged really effectively with industry on it thus far. And there's a kind of a common desire to make sure that we get ORES 1 right. However, we do need clarity on the auction date next year so that projects can engage with the supply chain and secure contracts and then ultimately deliver a cost competitive auction. Also, in addition to that, we do need a roadmap for the next auctions. We need to know when will ORES 2 for the phase 2 projects take place. What's the role for floating offshore wind for 2030? Will there be a preference category for offshore wind so we can kickstart that technology in Ireland? We need to get clarity on all that as soon as possible. On the MAP bill, we've had great progress. That's the Maritime Area Planning Bill. So Ireland is now undergoing a revamp of its offshore planning system. So government has made that its #1 policy priority by the end of this year. That's really welcome. And we need to keep that momentum now to make sure that the secondary legislation associated with it also goes through as quickly as possible. On grid, and a couple of the speakers have alluded to this already, it has been great to get clarity on the offshore grid model that we got in May from DEC, but it did obviously raise new questions and complexities. And so as Wind Energy Ireland, we are calling for an offshore grid steering committee to be set up between EirGrid, CRU, DEC and industry to make sure that we can work together and develop these standards and process offers, and I suppose understand how these projects are going to connect. In addition to that, we do need a stronger transmission grid, both off and onshore. We need to have a grid that's capable of bringing power from where it's generated to where it's needed. And I suppose shaping our electricity future is an important step in that regard, which EirGrid launched last month. I suppose not good for the onshore sector, but for offshore related projects, we need to support, the needed infrastructure to get these projects built. And in general, we need to support grid development, not just renewable energy installations, but grid itself, Otherwise, we won't be able to deliver on our climate targets. And the last point there that Daniel mentioned, you know, we do need to see an industrial strategy from government for the development of offshore wind in the next 10 years. As Daniel mentioned, it is looking now likely that the phase 1 projects will be developing in ports outside of Ireland. You know, we haven't seen that strategic investment in our ports that's needed. So we need to see an East Coast port identified for strategic investment as soon as possible for it to have a chance of contributing, and also a southern port identified to cater for that piece on the Atlantic coast. I have 2 quick slides left, which I'm just going to race through, just onto my next one there. And just to acknowledge that there has been some recent progress, you know, on the route to market side, you know, the design of that first offshore auction that I mentioned is taking place now. We expect that the auction will take place late next year. I suppose one unique point here is that projects are competing in the auction before they have a full planning consent. So that means it's a more complex auction design than you'd be used to seeing across Europe. But, you know, running that auction will bring needed certainty to the sector. On consenting, as I said, we are going through the process of revamping the offshore planning system. That's currently in the final stages, and that's really welcome, the speed at which that has progressed through the Houses of the Oireachtas. But as Daniel mentioned, we need to make sure that MARA is set up and running as quickly as possible to make sure that phase 2 projects can proceed as quickly as possible. And then on grid, you know, we welcome the recent engagement with EirGrid. They are working to kind of resource themselves properly to be able to take on the role as offshore transmission system operator and owner. You know, the engagement there has been really good recently. On to my final slide, and I'll finish with this. I couldn't finish without giving a mention to that huge potential that Daniel and David both mentioned on floating. So, you know, this is a huge potential for Ireland. We have access to one of the best offshore wind resources in the world. This is coupled with a vast maritime territory of over 220 million acres, 10 times the size of the island of Ireland. And much of this is in deeper waters, unsuitable for fixed bottom wind turbines. So that presents a huge opportunity for floating technology. You know, we've mentioned already 30 gigawatts in the program for government. That could be up to 50 or 75 gigawatts of potential off the west coast and the south coast. And I suppose while the technology is expensive at the moment, studies by Wind Europe predict that by 2030, you know, it'll start to converge towards the cost of fixed bottom and become far more cost competitive, with costs ultimately converging around 2040. So it will be important that Ireland is ready to capitalize on these cost trajectories, both for fixed and floating, and getting the policies in place to enable us to deploy floating and I suppose unlock that huge potential that we have off our south and west coast in particular. I'll leave it at that. Sorry if I went a couple of minutes over time, but looking forward to the discussion.
Not at all. I think, in fairness to all 4 speakers, have kept very much on time, which is great because it does allow people then have a bit of an engagement in questions. And there is a number of questions in already, and no doubt there'll be more. People, don't be shy, put in your questions. But just before I move over to the questions, just one thing that both Daniel and Niall touched on was the idea of that, like, you know, if we don't move quickly, as Niall put it, time is running out. Daniel put it, it'll be delivered from somewhere else if we don't do it. In terms of the risk that this can be, if you like, Scotland is well positioned and further advanced than we are. In terms of that risk, is there a fear that we could lose out on the opportunity and the multiplier in the economy if we don't act? And what actions do we have to take to make sure that doesn't happen? I'll go to maybe, I'll start with you, Niall, just if you wish to come in on that. And look, I'll ask everybody to come in, but I'll just begin with Niall.
Yeah, sure. I'll keep it very brief. So look, I think it's a really good question. And I would say absolutely there is the risk that we lose this to other jurisdictions. You know, Elaine touched on it there earlier in her presentation, just the scale of ambition that's happening at EU level. I think it's 450 gigawatts in the offshore renewable energy strategy that's set to be deployed by 2030. You know, if you were to, or sorry, by 2050, I think it is, but if you were to take the kind of scale of that growth, that means that, you know, there is a limited global supply chain here, and Ireland is going to be competing with other jurisdictions for the parts and the equipment and everything that goes into building an offshore turbine. As we get towards later in this decade, you know, we're already hearing from the supply chain that people are taking orders for 2026, 2027, 2028. You know, we need to make sure that that policy certainty is in place. And to be fair, we are heading in that direction with the ORES, with the grid, with the MAP bill. But we need to give that certainty to both the developers and the supply chain to make sure that when it comes to the point where our orders are being placed and the development of the wind farms is happening, that, you know, that we have that certainty, and we're not left behind, and the business is not lost to other jurisdictions. Daniel, you also mentioned about the ports and the development of the supply chain. You know, this is going to cost, you know, around 10 billion of initial investment, and it's going to create thousands of jobs across planning, development, construction, hundreds of long-term jobs in operations and management, and maintenance. But we're not ready to capture that level of investment for Irish companies yet. You know, this is going to be coming from other jurisdictions because we're not set up to do so. And that's why I think we really need to get an industrial strategy in place to make sure that we're ready to capture as much of that supply chain as possible, and make sure that while achieving our 5 gigawatts, which is absolutely possible if we get the policies right, that we're getting the benefits of the job creation and the supply chain benefits as well as we do so.
I suppose just coming to both Daniel and David, who are both, if you like, involved in the industry, are you concerned that we could miss a chance here and others could take advantage of it before us? I see, Daniel, your mic is turned on, so I'll come to you first and then David.
Okay, well, I suppose there's yes is the answer to the question. And it really depends on what Ireland's ambition is. And as David referenced, this is a global industry. And, you know, without referencing overly what happened with Equinor, there's other markets that this money can go to. And Ireland needs to identify, first off, what's our ambition? How much of the supply chain are we trying to achieve? Port of Nig in Scotland, which is just recently, last week, announced it's opening a tower manufacturing facility. So it's going to be building turbine towers with green hydrogen from offshore wind in the port. And that's the kind of piece. And frankly, if that's being developed in Scotland, the question is, has that opportunity already missed Ireland, or is that something that could still happen? Manufacturing needs certainty. And the manufacturing industry in turbines and turbine components need a pipeline of at least 1 gigawatt a year, where they can say, we can see an order pipeline of 1 gigawatt a year. And when we look at the wind float, we look at the turbine construction, and then we look at the assembly piece. Some people might say Ireland's already behind on winning any of the manufacturing piece. Really, are we already going to start slipping behind on the marshalling and assembly piece and operations and maintenance, where these will be deployed and managed and maintained from ports outside of this jurisdiction?
In terms of, if you boil that down, you have the construction, the deployment, and the maintenance are really the 3 big elements of the management of the stock, if you like. Just coming to you, David, of those 3, where should we be pitching ourselves, or where do you think is realistic that is practical, realistic ambition for Ireland to be looking to do from here?
I think the assembly bit offers great opportunity. Like, we have to realise that the UK is the leader in offshore wind development, and that it had installed over 10.4 gigawatts up to the end of 2020. And the UK's ambition is to grow that to 40 gigawatts by 2030. So that's a tripling, you know, 3 times, adding on 3 times more again. So that's a huge ambition. And, you know, I think they're going to need help. So when we look at developing our ports, we should look at not only our own requirements, but maybe helping out part of the UK's requirements, because we're so proximate to them. So I do think that even if our wind farms aren't consented and ready, we should be trying to get in on the act to try and help develop some of the UK offshore wind farms. And that'll give us the start we need and the bit of impetus we need to get going. And whatever is the easiest first, and I think assembly is probably the easiest way to get in, that's what we should do.
So what you're saying is basically we should develop our industry on the back of the UK developments, so that we're best placed when our developments begin to roll out. We have the if you like, the businesses and the infrastructure and the capability there to deliver on it from Ireland.
As best we can, yeah.
Elaine, from a European perspective, where should Europe is looking out at Ireland and saying we have this potential. have they confidence we can deliver?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we see Ireland is a key part of, I already mentioned the North Seas Energy Cooperation, and I think that's a very strong cooperation of member states that are working in the North Seas to deploy offshore wind. But I think what the previous speakers mentioned is very important. It's really crucial to do an analysis of where the jobs potential and the growth potential is. When we were developing the offshore strategy, we surveyed companies within the EU, and we found that between 9 and 30% of them had identified skills shortages. And I think this is really important. And I would like to just put out there that within the EU budget for 2021 to 2027, there are cohesion funds available for skills, for training. And I think that's something that from a strategic perspective, it's important to look into.
I think it's important in terms of what Daniel was saying, in terms of a 10-year plan in relation to this, to be able to access the funding to train people up to take advantage. Just moving over to some of the questions, and I'll probably start with my county colleague, Senator John McGahan, because he's looking at what we can learn from those who are further ahead of us. And he's asked a question, if you take the like of Scotland, that is more advanced than we are, what can we actually learn from what Scotland have done? I know Daniel has referenced the Port of Mig, for instance, but surely, and no different than what David has said about we could take advantage to build our own capacity. What should we do with Scotland, that is a world leader on our doorstep? What should we do to actually take advantage of this opportunity? I'll start with I'll do it the other way around. I'll come to Elaine first, if that's all right. What I'll say to you guys, whoever wants to jump first, turn on your mic, and I'll come to you first, if that's okay. Elaine.
Well, look, at EU level, we're working very hard to really grow the strategy across the EU, and we're also in the process as well of discussing with the UK about potential cooperation as well in the future. What we see is really that there's a potential across every member state for this strategy, and so every member state has their own potential and has their own particular capabilities in terms of already existing supply chains or their coastal proximity. Denmark, for example, is also quite a small coastal country, but has a huge base as well in terms of offshore wind, but also in terms of their manufacturing capability as well. So I think there are many member states also that we can learn from, and also, of course, from our neighbours. It's really a question of understanding what's the potential for Ireland. And then seeing how best to exploit that. But I think there are many other examples and good practices that can be followed, certainly.
Okay, Daniel, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, just look, I'll say ports. I think Irish ports have been massively underinvested in. By comparison, I see a question in there from David Minton in the Northwest Regional Assembly, basically comparing us to Malta, which, is smaller than County Sligo. There's 5 tier 1 ports, or thereabouts. Ireland is massively behind. So we need to radically update our ports, our port infrastructure. I think it's a fantastic point that David makes that, we can do that now to start working on UK projects.
David, Niall, do you want to come in there? We move on. Niall, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Look, I suppose what can we take from other jurisdictions and Scotland in particular? I suppose not to be banging the same drum again, but that policy certainty, that sort of predictability of when auctions are going to happen, give the industry certainty that they know that they're going to be aiming for an auction at X date in X year, and they know that they're getting themselves in order to compete in that auction, making sure that the planning system is set up and ready and properly resourced to make sure that, both the project developers and the supply chain have the confidence in the system that they can go in and deliver good prices in that auction then as well. And then I suppose there's other things that we can see, in the UK, we have things like, industrial clusters, for example. I think the example that's always, brought up is the port of Grimsby, which was a kind of a small fishing village going back maybe 15 years ago and is now a massive industrial port for offshore development. And that's just because, attention was given to it and investment was made there. And if we could incentivize that kind of investment, maybe in one of our ports or in a particular location, and maybe see if we could kind of develop these kind of offshore wind clusters, and enable businesses to develop their resources to a point where they can, support the development of offshore wind domestically and kind of compete in European and global markets, as Daniel and David alluded to, and Elaine indeed, you know, that'd be really important. And then also I'd agree with what Elaine said about the skills shortage. You know, I think we do need to make sure that we're maximizing the opportunities for employment coming out of this. And I think there could be a good policy put in place where we could coordinate the work of schools and universities, training bodies, skills development programs, just to, I suppose, identify the most cost-effective ways to eliminate the skills gap and ensure we have a workforce ready to kind of step into this sector as it grows. You know, we're in the early stages. We can't, no doubt about that, but it is going to grow rapidly. And the more we can do now to prepare ourselves for that growth, the better.
Okay, David?
Yeah, just to say that a lot of the players and developers that we have are global players, so they know what it's all about. And if we got, as Niall says, the policy in place, we could get certainty and confidence in our industry. And like, these particular wind farms don't just happen overnight. In order to build them, the vessels that you need to put up the wind turbines or to lay some of the cables in the seabed, they need to be ordered and booked 2 years in advance. So that's why I'm saying that it's a global industry with global players, and they need to have absolute confidence and certainty before they'll make that commitment. So that's what we need to give.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes to maybe another question that we've in from Jennifer Elvin in relation to the Equinor situation, where, if you like, she asked a question about people having confidence in Ireland to deliver. Have we, like, will we be able to step up to the mark? And I suppose, I don't know if anyone wants to make the comment in relation to Equinor, where they've essentially withdrawn from the Irish market. And is that a question? Is there a question in that as to what we need to do? I know we have suggested, like, if you like, the 10-year framework. And in fairness to the government, as Niall has pointed out, in the last 12 months, there's been a lot of work in terms of the legislation, the underpin, the like of the auctions and the strategies going forward. But what do we learn from Equinor or is there any particular learnings from it that we need to take on board? Niall?
Yeah, look, I'll go first, and then whoever else can jump in. I think it's important to say, look, it's unfortunate that happened, and that Equinor did leave the Irish market there a month or so ago. You know, obviously they were involved in a number of projects with ESB, and you know, projects with huge potential and still have huge potential there. I suppose we could treat it as a wake-up call. You know, that I suppose the timing is unfortunate because, you know, around now is when we're actually seeing things moving from a policy perspective. And like, credit has to go to the different arms of government for that. You know, the department are really kind of trying to get ORES ready for next year. You know, we are seeing that government have set out that the MAP bill is the #1 policy priority to get through at the end of this year. And we're hopefully all of that will kind of be over the line as soon as possible, and we can see Mara kind of getting up and running as soon as possible as well. And then on the grid side, you know, I can only commend EirGrid for the kind of recent couple of months and kind of progress they've been making in kind of getting everything in order on the offshore grid side and how we're going to connect these projects. So the timing is unfortunate, but I suppose it's a wake-up call to say that, you know, this is a massive international player, and they've pulled out of the Irish market. We need to make sure that doesn't happen again by making sure that these frameworks are in place and there's absolutely no uncertainty and no doubt in any investor's mind that Ireland is serious about delivering that 5 gigawatt and beyond, you know, into that 30 gigawatt target longer term off our Atlantic coast. But I again, look, it's given that certainty to market, I think, and making sure that we have these policies in place and I suppose getting the pipeline moving through the system and towards that sort of deployment phase towards the end of the decade. That's what we want to see.
I think a big part is the background to give the confidence, and that's where the like a 10-year strategy would be important. Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, Equinor is a very well publicized decision, and you know, as Niall says, maybe a very well timed wake up call to the Irish economy and what can happen. That this industry will move elsewhere because other places will move. But I think one instance less well publicized was the Afloat project, which was a 31 million euro demonstrator project earmarked to be done off the Amet site in the off the Mayo coast, and it didn't progress for the exact same reasons, and because the licensing side of things couldn't be couldn't meet the deadlines. And the project has since moved to the Mediterranean, I understand, or to southern France. So that was meant to be a demonstrator project to prove to industry that this technology could and would survive in the west coast of Ireland, and it's not. And I think it's very simple. It is the legislation, it is the ports, and it is the grid. It is those three things. Those are our three roadblocks, and those are the things that we need to get moving.
I think, in fairness, to summarising those three, is I think they are the three big ones, and if we could land those three, we'd be making progress. David, I see you nodding there. Do you want to add a comment in?
Yeah, no, the grid is definitely, we haven't spoken much about it apart from acknowledging that EirGrid has got its plan together to connect the 5 gigawatts potentially from the East Coast. But we need to be looking at a plan now to connect the potential floating off the West Coast. Like the time scale needed to deliver our infrastructure in Ireland is huge. It's 10 to 15 years minimum. So if we want to connect some of that offshore floating wind in the future, we need to be doing something about it now and figuring out what it is we need to be doing now. And and we're not doing that. We're looking at the East Coast, which is fine. We have to do it, but we should also be looking beyond what's the scenario at 2050, what will our grid look like at 2050, and how are we going to deliver it? And because it just takes so long through consenting, procurement, build out, and commissioning.
Elaine, from your perspective or from the European perspective, did that set off alarm bells, or what's your sense of it?
So actually, that's what we hear all the time, that policy certainty is incredibly important. And also one of the big bottlenecks is around consenting, planning, licensing. So at EU level, we're working on this. We've got the TENI legislation that's currently in the middle of negotiations. Maybe Sean will know more about that than I do at the moment. But it's going through negotiations, and we're hoping that over the next couple of days that we might have the revised TENI regulation, where we're looking at putting a one-stop shop for planning, which would be really helpful for developers. What we see is that there's so many different things that need to come together for planning for an offshore grid. You've got the onshore grid reinforcements. You also have the maritime spatial planning. You have, and many of these are in different departments or in different, even at different layers. If you have a federal setup of government. So it can be very challenging to align all of this. So at EU level, we're doing what we can on EU regulation, but this also needs to come together at national level. And Ireland seems to be making huge strides in that area. So I can only encourage the work to continue further.
Okay, thanks. And just to say to people, a reminder yet again to keep your questions coming. And also there was a couple of questions there in relation to slides. Certainly we'll be making the slides available with the agreement, obviously, of the speakers afterwards. And also I'd like to welcome my colleague Sean Kelly, as I said earlier, will be joining us. So we'll come to Sean in a little while. We'll get a few more questions first, maybe come to Sean then. But basically, yes, I think, look, we've made the points in relation to the key things that has to happen. Just moving on to the next question. It comes from, I already mentioned by Daniel A. David mentioned from the Northwest Regional Authority. He's asked a question, I suppose, if you consider this first 5 gigawatts is basically fixed bottom and essentially on the East Coast. And the next big challenge then is to move over to the West Coast. And because of the nature of it, I think Niall touched on it as well, it's going to be floating offshore wind. And he's just asking, what will the challenges be with that floating offshore? Like, it is a fundamentally different scenario. It is a fundamentally more challenging environment. While the wind yields are much higher on the West Coast, you also have to face the higher tidal we'll say rougher seas. So in terms of that, what are the challenges and what do we need to do to get ahead of those challenges? I know, for instance, there was potentially a floating platform that could have come to the West Coast that didn't come to the West Coast. So I suppose that's in terms of the 5 to 10 year plan. These are sort of things we need to take advantage of. Hey, David, do you want to come in there first as someone in that part of the world who has very much an interest in that side of it?
Yeah, the anchoring of the wind turbines obviously is a key concern because you don't want them floating away and becoming rogue. So, you know, good secure anchorages are one thing. There is another development in the future that's being looked at the moment using superconductors for electrical cabling. So it's where metals are subjected to extreme cooling and their properties change and become better conductors of electricity. So it is hoped that that will have an influence not just on cables and subsea cables and direct current transmission cables, but also on the wind turbine generators themselves and in the offshore platforms. So it's hoped that while you have some very, very, very big offshore platforms being contemplated at the moment, that they might reduce substantially in size with the use of superconductors over the coming years. So it's a question of figuring it all that out to minimize the footprint, obviously, that's in the sea, and obviously having whatever you put in the sea, having it secure.
I don't know if any of the rest of you want to jump in on that question. And Niall?
Yeah, I might jump in briefly. Maybe just, I suppose, to touch on David's earlier point, where he spoke about, you know, what will the grid in 2050 look like? I think that probably touches on the answer to the question almost. Like, what's the plan after 2030? If you look, Shaping Our Electricity Future came out from EirGrid last month, and it sets out the plan for the next 9 years of what the different works will be up until the end of the decade, and that's really important. I suppose now is probably the time to look at what comes next and what comes after 2030, and how are we going to move towards, you know, potentially a zero carbon electricity system by 2035, 2040. You know, obviously floating offshore wind off our west and southern coast are going to have a massive role to play in that. But we need to make sure that the grid is developed and that they're able to connect, and that we can bring those vast amounts of electricity onshore and towards those demand centers and where it's needed. And I suppose, you know, what do we need clarity on there? You know, we probably need clarity on, you know, what are the auctions, what kind of auctions are going to happen after ORES 1 and ORES 2? What's going to happen for post 2030? What does as most on the call will know, EirGrid set out their kind of grid model, future offshore grid model in May. And after 2030, it becomes a centralized plan-led grid model. So EirGrid will kind of, you know, lead the way in where the grid goes. So, you know, we need to see what does that look like. We need to see what kind of form that will take. And I suppose as well, if we want to be able to capture floating wind post 2030, we need to look at it now. And what do we need in the immediate term? And I suppose from our perspective, the most logical thing would be that for the auction that happens in perhaps 2025, the ORES 2 auction, we would have a separate pot for floating technology, you know, a certain amount of capacity, you know, I suppose ring fenced off for floating, so that we can make sure we can get this technology can get a foothold in the market, and we can start deploying it as early as possible. And I suppose benefit from some of these cost trajectories that are being seen across other European jurisdictions. You know, I think that'd be a really important thing for government to deliver, would be that floating pot so that floating can compete pre-2030. Also hydrogen, you know, we haven't spoken about green hydrogen much, but like, Ireland is one of the EU countries that hasn't yet come forward with a green hydrogen strategy. Obviously, that's an important potential route to market for floating offshore wind in those quantities, and kind of will facilitate our ability to export alongside, you know, that sort of pan-European grid development. So I think it'd be really positive if government came forward with a green hydrogen strategy and show us exactly how we're going to develop green hydrogen, give it a route to market, and what investment is needed. And then the other points that we've mentioned around ports and everything like that would be really important as well for floating. But yeah, I think now is the time to start the work on that and to see how exactly we're going to reach that 30 gigawatts.
We'll try to keep moving on, because there is a number of questions coming in. If we go to everybody, we won't get through it in the time. But two questions that have come from Dennis Naughton TD. One is about the Atlantic interconnector, and the other is the point that Niall has raised about alternative uses of the fuels. If you like, if we can produce in excess of our current usage, is it to be an interconnector to Europe, or is it to be converted into hydrogen or ammonia or an alternative fuel like that? I suppose maybe I'll come to you, Elaine, first in terms of the European perspective on that. Is that piece of infrastructure that would connect us to Europe, is that part of the European dream, we'll call it?
Absolutely. This project, the Celtic Interconnector, it's long been a project of common interest. And indeed, it's been substantially co-funded as well by the European Commission. It's going to be a very important project both for Ireland and for France. So I think it's very important to think as well at a high level about how the whole grid around Europe is connected. Of course, grids take a long time, and they take time for planning, consenting, and also for building. And in that sense, I think coming back a little bit to the discussion we had earlier about what happens after 2030, I think that's also important. That a lot of these projects, even though this Atlantic interconnector, the Celtic interconnector, will be built by 2025, 2026, maybe another one as well to the UK, but that's not going to be enough for 30 gigawatts of offshore wind to bring it to Europe. The cables just simply wouldn't handle that. And so I think what's really important is, well, what do we do with the wind, which was also, and what do we do with the green electricity, which is also what some of the other speakers talked about. On hydrogen, I would just like to mention that this week we're announcing a hydrogen and decarbonisation of gas package by the European Commission. So that will be going through the legislative process over the next year or so. And so that's something that I would encourage you all to look out for, because we really see that green hydrogen can really help us. We say now about the current electricity demand in the EU, but of course, every single decarbonisation scenario that we look at 2050 shows a significant electrification of the economy. So our electricity demand is going to go up. So there will be a huge demand for this green electricity, and then also the extent that hydrogen can play a role will be very important there as well. So I think looking beyond 2030 and looking to 2050, it's really important, and it's already I think it's already crucial to start thinking about it now.
In terms of just where we're going with the green hydrogen or the interconnector or both, in terms of just realistically, I suppose I'll come back to Lane for a second, but to the rest of you as well. Where, like between the grid we have, the interconnector to Europe, and the potential to, we'll say, for heavy goods vehicles, for aviation, for maritime, for all those reasons that we need a dense fuel to replace fossil fuels. Where is the strategy for Ireland? How much priority should we put on the interconnector? How much priority should we put on our grid? And how much priority should we put on the renewable fuels in the short term if we are to progress these? I'll start with Lane and maybe come to Niall and David and Dinah then.
We'll need all of those. I think there's no single solution that's going to get us there, and it's also not entirely clear exactly what new technologies will emerge over the next couple of years, and exactly how exactly what kind of innovation can take place as well beyond 2030. So I think it's important that we don't close any avenues now. It's absolutely crucial, and as we electrify transport and heating, I think we're really going to need to use all the resources that we have. There's no one single solution here. I think it will be a combination of many. And there of course, at EU level as well, we are supporting quite a lot of research and innovation projects looking at all of these aspects.
Niall, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, sure. Look, I'd agree with Elaine. I don't think there's any one of these that is the answer. I think it's a combination of everything. I think in the immediate term on that green hydrogen side, I think just getting a strategy in place and I suppose setting out how we're going to, stimulate supply and demand of green hydrogen, how we're going to facilitate growth in it. I think that'd be really kind of a welcome step if that were to come forward as soon as possible. Wind Energy Ireland will actually release a new report in January on green hydrogen and look at the kind of the demand domestically in Ireland for green hydrogen and where the potential might be for that. So maybe hang tight for that. And it's sure to be an interesting read. We're doing it together with Gavin and Doherty Geo Solutions. So that should kind of give some information on that. I suppose on the grid side, interconnection is really important. It enables us to kind of export when we have excess wind and import when we need it, and it's part of our kind of transition to that zero carbon economy and be able to reduce the amount of fossil fuels in our system. I think if we could set out a target for Ireland to have no fossil fuels in our system by 2035 or 2040 or so, I think that'd be really positive, but we wouldn't be able to do that without things like long duration storage and green hydrogen and interconnection. So it's a kind of a mix of all technologies in that transition to a zero carbon economy.
And just before I do come to David now, but I suppose from my own perspective, I'm on the Transport Committee over here in Brussels, and the challenges for maritime and aviation heavy goods vehicles to transition away from fossil fuels is a big part of our challenges. So certainly the relevance of the green hydrogen or the alternative fuels, the green fuels, is such a priority that I think it has to be a central part of it. David?
Yeah, just to, I agree with Elena and with Niall, but just to add that we have, quite a big gas network here, and we have to, I suppose, come up with a strategy as to how that will operate again from 2030, 2050, and whether it'll be a blend of hydrogen and biomethane, or and what that blend will be, and so. That's a natural asset that gives us a conduit for the delivery and transportation of hydrogen. And, we have to be mindful of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a key part. Daniel, if you want to throw in on that, just before you come in, the other thing that's just to keep rolling with the questions and maybe build them in. Roger Sweetman has talked about the infrastructure, in particular air grid here at home in Ireland. Like, it's one thing to talk about the interconnector, but the fuels and the grid here in Ireland as well. So I don't know if you want to comment on fuels and the grid maybe.
Yeah, I suppose just in relation to the hydrogen piece, and to echo what the previous speakers have saying, there isn't a silver bullet in renewables and in decarbonisation. There are going to be different solutions for different scenarios. Driving an EV car for your house makes sense, and having electrifying trucks, from what we're told, isn't going to make sense. So in different scenarios, different things will play. Something we're acutely aware of, and maybe as an island nation we should be looking at more, is the marine sector. 6% of all global emissions come from global shipping. If we can tackle that and alone, and by producing hydrogen and e-fuel derivatives of hydrogen in Irish ports, and supplying the marine sector, that would absolutely be a win. I think there's going to be a twin track approach where you have grid and also hydrogen production. Hydrogen is going to be needed in certain areas, and it will be transported potentially as ammonia, various different fuel carriers like that. And ammonia seems to be leading the way in terms of that charge. So I'd say you're going to have a hydrogen ammonia economy, and you're going to have a grid economy, and the two should be twin tracked.
Okay, well, maybe just moving on and maybe back to the East Coast again. Alan Tobin has asked two questions. One in relation to the 5 gigawatts by 2030, which ultimately is all fixed bottom, pretty much most of it on the East Coast. Will that be delivered? Can that be delivered? And the second question maybe that ties into that, in terms of financial support at European level, in terms of the Green Deal and that, is there finance, he wants to know, available through the Green Deal or other sources of funding to help deliver on these renewable energy potential? I'll maybe start with you, Elaine, on that one. I know you did touch on it briefly earlier.
Yeah, I think what's really important is that there's been a lot of mainstreaming of the climate objectives through a lot of the EU funding now. So what you'll see through the Recovery and Resilience Programme is that a lot of funding from the EU is being channeled into the green agenda. And so there is funding available, and but how that is allocated at national level is of course up to the member states. What we're doing at EU level is facilitating money for skills, for upskilling, and through cohesion funds. There's also possibilities for research and innovation. EirGrid, for example, take part in quite a lot, and ESB as well are taking part in quite a few Horizon Europe programs in order to demonstrate and to do some early stage research as well into the renewables integration into the grid. So I think there is funding available, but there's quite a significant discretion at national level for what exact channels that green funding takes. And I think at EU level or at Irish level, what we've certainly seen is that the integration of renewables into the grid is important as well, and that there is funding there available for it.
Noel, can the 5 gigawatts be delivered, and what's your sense of that?
Look, I think 5 gigawatts can definitely be delivered. But as I said in my presentation at the start, you know, we are under pressure with time on this. And I think the next 9 months to a year is going to be really crucial to determine whether we're going to deliver it or not. You know, we have 6 phase 1 projects, 5 of them on the East Coast, 1 on the West Coast. You know, we have the first auction is due to happen in the second part, or probably the second half of next year. So in advance of that, if we want those projects to go in and compete, we need to make sure that we have all of the technical clarifications they need from a connection perspective in advance of preparing their bids for that auction. We need to make sure that they have their maritime area consents granted by the minister to make sure that they're ready to compete. And, you know, we need to make sure that, you know, that they you know, everything is provided to them, and that they're given that sort of certainty, I suppose, from a policy perspective, that they can compete in that auction. Then at the same time, that's not going to be enough to get to the 5 gigawatts. We need that second phase of projects too. And as I mentioned, there's loads of projects that are in various stages of development. We need to figure out what the phase 2 projects are. What's the criteria for those? How are they going to go through the planning system? When are they going to go into the planning system? When are they going to compete in an auction? If we can sort all that, we definitely can get back on track for the 5 gigawatts. But we do have a lot of policy challenges between now and, say, this time next year. And, you know, if we have this same conversation next year and those things haven't been done, then we could be in trouble. But certainly at this point, we still have time to get those things back on track.
Yeah, we'll keep moving on because there's still 5 or 6 questions, and I do want to get to Sean, because I know Sean has done a lot of work in this area as well, and I'd like to give Sean a few minutes just to elaborate from his end, or a little bit of an overview of it from the European context as well. But just moving on to the whole planning piece, George O'Connor's asked a question about planning. I suppose he probably has a lot of experience from, let's say, onshore planning issues, where a lot of vexatious objections, a lot of different challenges that were judicial reviews and various things like that have caused problems and slowed things down. From the offshore perspective, is the ability to get planning going to be a challenge, or is the new legislation going to make a real difference in terms of that? Just handing over, I suppose, maybe start with maybe Niall. I think you might know a little bit on this one, and maybe David as well. Niall?
Yeah, look, it will be a challenge. It's always a challenge. You know, these projects will have to, you know, once, say, for example, once they get their maritime area consents, then they'll have to, you know, look at then going into their pre-engagement with onboard Planola, and then they'll go through the system, and hopefully they'll get their planning as soon as possible, maybe sometime in 2023 or 2024. They're going into this auction without planning, remember, which is very unusual across Europe. So that's going to, you know, bring a bit of uncertainty into how they approach the auction as well. And then you have the risk of judicial review, and even, like, not to get into the weeds too much, but if you look at how the terms and conditions of the first offshore auction are drafted, it doesn't make much allowance for that judicial review to come in. And look, we know from onshore that this can happen and often happens, you know what I mean? So it isn't going to be straightforward. But I suppose what we need to make sure now is that, you know, the MAP bill is finalised now in the House of the Oireachtas, and that the department are able to bring forward the secondary legislation that's needed on that, around things like design flexibility, around and different aspects like that, and make sure that it's very clear for projects as they prepare to go into the planning system. The other point that I think is really important to mention here is resourcing. You know, on board Planola, you know, they are really good people in there, but these are €1 billion projects that we're talking about here. And we need to make sure that we have on board Planola adequately resourced with the staff and people with the right expertise to deal with these offshore applications, and make sure that there's no unnecessary delays caused as a result of resourcing, things that we could fix if we put the needed resources in there. You know what I mean? But look, it's going to be a challenge, and you know, we just need to make sure that it's streamlined as much as possible, and any of these potential pitfalls are avoided now.
Hey, David?
Just to follow up from Niall's point, all of these phase 1 projects involve, they involve an onshore element as well. When you bring the electricity ashore, you build a substation and you've cables and all of that. And they're all at 110 kV and above, 220, most of them will be at. So they're all strategic infrastructure development projects at the moment. So they go through the planning, that planning process at the moment, those first lot of projects anyway. And so they are subject to, you know, the public consultations and the planning, the SID process and judicial reviews and all of that. So yeah, that's another layer of complexity onto the planning process.
Yeah, certainly it is. But I think in fairness, hopefully with some level of streamlining, it will make it that little bit straightforward. And I think it's back to the point we made earlier about policy certainty. That if people know what the situation is going to be, that will help the scenario in that regard. Just another question that's in from AR, and I suppose maybe it's one for you to start with you and Daniel. It's in relation to the fishing industry. Like at times, I know there was a policy went through the PESH committee, which I represent on. We all have a number of hats over here in Brussels, but I'm associate on the PESH committee. And the question is whether or not this is going to influence fisheries, and have fisheries something to be concerned about here. I know it's a question that's come up to me in your part of the world, up in Killybegs on a number of occasions.
I would say nature abhors a vacuum. And at the moment, there's a vacuum of information. And when people don't have the right information, they're likely to come to the worst case scenario conclusion. Fishing has been and continues to be the core focus in Killybegs. It's a really important industry for Donegal. And the good news from a fishing perspective is that these are two industries that can, should, and will coexist very successfully alongside each other. The fishing season is really peaks January, February, March time. That's the peak fishing season. That's the last time of year that you want to be going out, deploying people out to offshore wind farms. The skill set, marine engineering capabilities that have been developed in the fishing industry along the West Coast, but I do speak with a Killybegs bias, is second to none. The level of seamanship, the marine engineering that is there and available in the port is a really huge asset and benefit to the offshore renewable industry, but is also a great opportunity for jobs. I know that Elaine had quoted a figure in terms of the jobs potential that the EU sees here. And I believe that the west coast of Ireland, from Killybegs all the way down along, will take the entire fishing industry and many other computer tech industries and give them a whole added lease of life without any threat to their existing operations.
I don't know, do Elaine or any of the rest, do you want to jump in there and make a comment on that? Or?
Yeah, happy to say just that this is something that we come across quite a lot, that I mentioned it as well at the beginning, and it's very important. What has happened in the past is that certain areas have been designated for fishing, for Natura 2000, for defence, for international shipping lines, and then it's just the rest is left over, and some of that then can be given to offshore wind. When we look at how much of the maritime space we need in order to reach our targets, we only need about 3% of the maritime space to reach our offshore renewable energy targets that have been set out. But I think the key to this will be coordination and planning. So maritime spatial planning is a competence at national level. But what we are doing is publishing guidance as well on how multi-use, how you can have a multi-use approach to the sea basin, and also there's now more requirements to also cooperate with the neighbours and be in dialogue with the neighbours as well. And I think that's really important in order to make sure we use the space effectively and not divide it up so clearly and only have one use per area. I think that's not going to get us to where we need to be.
I think that's a very important point. And it's one thing, certainly, I would have had dealings with one Oriel wind farm, which has been developed alongside us in County Louth, and Parkwind, who's behind that in Belgium, have done a lot of work around, if you like, the potential of wind farms to create almost a coral effect and a haven for fish to develop. So the synergies between the two, actually, it's like what Daniel said. If there's a vacuum, people will assume one thing, but maybe there's an education we don't see that the two can work quite effectively together. Look, there's a number of other questions here. Paul McGonigal has asked about the concern, if you like, about losing our resources and others, if you like, outside investment coming in, and if you like, corporate investment from outside and it being lost to Ireland. And certainly I think that's one issue that I personally would like to focus on in terms of the community gain element of this. There was submissions to be made to the department last week in relation to the community gain funds and other elements of the RESS. And one thing I would have focused strongly on is the need to ensure that community gain remains with the local community. I think there was a suggestion that that could be a national pot, but I think it'd be important for local investment and for local people to reap the reward of what the resources in their area, particularly in places like the west coast of Ireland, where we'll have the multiplier in the economy, certainly in terms of jobs, and we'll have the if you like, the impact it will have in terms of building extra infrastructure and all that. But equally, if the ordinary community on the ground feel that this has passed them by or they don't have skin in the game, I think that's not good. And a community gain is such a critical part of that, to see something in your local community that the community has benefited in terms of that. I don't know, Daniel, I see you want to come in there.
I would totally agree. And again, to reference Dennis Naughton in the regional TDs bill, it was something that they were also very supportive, that the community fund should rest and stay with the community, and that's going to be a big part of buy-in. I would take that as given. I can't believe that they were looking at considering making it a national pot. But I would also say training, jobs. I'm a father. I've a family in the Northwest, and in that scenario, I want to see my son able to get a job here in the Northwest. I want to see training opportunities opening up here in the Northwest where he's able to avail of that. And I think that will make it a very real opportunity for people.
Okay, look, I think we'll have to look, that community gain piece I think is very important. It's one certainly I want to focus on in the short term, and probably we'll look at doing another, if you like, wind energy seminar from the perspective of the community. And I think that's very important, because ultimately, if we don't get buy-in on the ground, like those vexatious objections that George O'Connell was referring to, and the having to face judicial reviews, if we can get buy-in from people on the ground and see it, there's a benefit for them, I think that is one critical element of the overall package. But at this stage, I want to come across to Sean Kelly, because I know Sean, like myself, has a great interest in this area and has been working on a lot of the elements of it here at European level. So I know, Sean, you've heard what all the speakers have had to say in the questions and answers. Maybe a little bit of perspective from your end as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Colin, and thanks for organising this very worthwhile event. Most interesting and practical, which I always look for. And I would like to thank the speakers, Elaine, Daniel, David and Niall. And of course, a little over 2 years ago, Niall was my assistant in the European Parliament, advising me, and now he's advising and planning the delivery of these wonderful ambitions. And I suppose looking at it from an objective point of view, it's good actually that Ireland has at least a big ambition in this area. 5 gigawatts and then 30 gigawatts, at least is there. And the industry plus the government can help to deliver it. It's going to be a big challenge, and no doubt about it, a lot of things have to happen to make it a reality. And of course, subsequent to that as well, we also have to be developing a green hydrogen strategy. And Niall referenced that, and I've written to Minister Ryan about that, and hopefully that too can be published very soon. But looking at a few points there, one of the key points at this moment for me is, and it has been referenced, is the whole question of permitting and licensing, etc. It is one of the biggest hurdles in the whole question of renewables technologies. Niall outlined there what can actually happen. And we are the world leaders in terms of objecting to projects and having judicial reviews and serial objectors and so forth. And that's why I have proposed at European level that there would be a Fit for 55 label on positive energy projects that would allow them to be streamlined and go through the process without the necessary red tape and so forth, because they would have higher priority status. And I think that's something we should look at if we are to deliver, because you see, we can't wait here. There's a target for 2030 we must reach. Other projects you could wait for a few years, but you cannot wait here. Every time you wait, you're not reaching your targets. So I think that's something I would like to see happening. You referenced Equinor, and Equinor said they left the Irish market because of regulatory uncertainty. So the government, and we're part of it, can cover it up the way they like, but it is an example of frustration that can be there. And it means that we must do something about it. And that's why I think that Fit for 55 label, which I'm proposing, it might help to get over this whereas other general projects which do not contribute directly to reduce our emissions would maybe have to go through the process as it is now. And I'd like to see that happening, because time is of the essence. This is what we have to get across to government and everyone else. Time is of the essence. It's like playing a match. You have to have the match over in an hour or an hour and 10 minutes, and you can't be turning up late for the second half and going to lose out. So the same here. And then there are other areas which you touched on, which are absolutely vital. The whole question of the ports. And I think it was Daniel referred to a coordinated approach across the West Coast, and maybe the same, of course, across the East Coast. And only 2 weeks ago, I hosted a seminar, something similar to this, about how Ireland is going to contribute to climate neutral EU, and in terms of emissions. And Pat Keating, the CEO of the Port of Fines, was there, and I highlighted some points in that and how they were getting ready. And indeed, one of the points which he mentioned is absolutely vital, that MARA is set up as quickly as possible. There's no excuse again for government to be delaying that. That's absolutely vital. And then to have that coordinated approach across the ports of the West to capitalise on the massive potential is there, because as your speakers pointed out, the electricity is not going to stay out in the Atlantic. It has to come inshore, and obviously the ports have a key role there, and we must get that organised as vitally important. And then, of course, the whole question of grids. And Niall did say EirGrid are doing their very best on the SB to ensure that we have the proper grid connection. But ultimately, if we're going to have 30 gigawatts coming from offshore wind, as Elaine was saying, we will need probably another 1 or 2 interconnectors with France to utilise it. So again, the whole question, having the grid ready though, within Ireland and connected, is going to be hugely important. Another factor which I think was very, very important as well, and I'm glad to see it being highlighted here, is the whole question of skills. Because I'm the rapporteur which was being voted on this week for the energy performance of buildings. And then we're going to have to retrofit thousands and thousands, millions probably, of buildings across the European Union. But where are the workers going to come to do it? Have they the skills? Have the young people the knowledge that this is where they should be heading for, rather than maybe traditional careers? And I think that's a big challenge for us. And Elaine is right, the European Union is doing an awful lot in that area to get that message across. But certainly we can do far more in Ireland. And then, of course, if we can have a manufacturing base for the turbines, etc., that would be vital. Because again, as David and Daniel were pointing out, it's going to be a hugely competitive market as all countries across the globe try and increase their wind energy. So we should be actually looking at how we can manufacture the basic components, and indeed probably export them. Because if they aren't going to be manufactured here, they're going to be manufactured elsewhere, and we're going to be importing them. But that's going to take a big investment, but a good policy initiative at government level as well. And it's not just in terms of manufacturing them, it's also the whole question of maintenance. And again, I was just looking recently at buildings, especially big buildings across the European Union. The maintenance level there and the quality of engineers that's required to actually do the maintenance and keep things working, like air pumps, etc., all that is huge. And the same here with the turbines. They all need to be constantly looked at and maintained. So again, there's a huge, and we'd like to see an overall strategy in Ireland and indeed in Europe. How are we going to do all this in Europe and get the benefits, rather than depending maybe on raw materials being imported from countries where it is actually increasing emissions because they haven't got the same level of ambition as we have. So it is one thing for Europe to be reducing emissions, but if we are importing lots of raw materials which are being manufactured in countries that are not reducing emissions or increasing them, that's actually counterproductive. Okay, we have CBAM and so forth, which we hope to tackle that, but to be far better, both within Ireland and in Europe, to have a policy how we could do that. So I might leave it there because we could talk about this forever. It's a growing area. I'm delighted with the interest that's there because the interest will lead to momentum. The momentum will lead to policy changes at government level. And once we make the right policies, and put the right supports behind it, then we can move very, very quickly. So again, thanks to everybody, and thanks to you, Colin.
Thank you very much, Sean. And it's clear, like, your interest in this, and I know it's long held, no different than my own. I think you've been at this for many years, along with Niall, when Niall was over here with you in the Parliament, and indeed my own interest goes back to when Oriel Wind Farm began to talk with establishing a wind farm off the coast just off me, which is hopefully potentially going to make landfall. The electricity will make landfall less than a mile from where I am, and hopefully in the next couple of years. They've been on the go for 10 years, so it's good to see that it's finally coming to fruition. But just I would like to come back to the speakers, but we're sort of tight on time. Just to follow up from what John said, like, just to summarise really, and pick up from what the speakers have said, to summarise really the 3 or 4 key points that's there. The one I think was made strong was the policy certainty. We need policy certainty over the next 10 years to give people confidence and direction. And I suppose as part of that, we need a 10-year framework to, if you like, set out what the different issues are. The like of, as Sean mentioned, the skills needs, the like of the supply chain requirements, the like of getting involved maybe in the UK projects to a point that they will be part of what we do here, that we will be ready for when it comes here to Ireland. And then I suppose the key blockages that are there, the grid, the legislative one, and if you like, the port capacity. I think they're the ones we very much identified, particularly on the legislation side. I think it's been positive, if you like, the legislation going through the Dáil this autumn, and hopefully that will give them, if you like, the foundation for the RES schemes going forward. One is imminent, I suppose. The second one, the sooner we know when it's going to be, is very important. And indeed, the MARA legislation in terms of licensing at sea. So I think in terms of getting those blockages out of the way and giving that certainty and creating that framework to go forward, I think it is critical. So look, I'll leave it at that. I don't know, maybe if the 4 speakers, I'll give them maybe 1 minute apiece if they have any wish to summarise the wish to do, and then we'll wrap it up at that. I'll start with Elaine first, as you started first.
Thank you very much. So I guess in summary, I'd just like to say thank you very much. I think this is a very timely event, very focused on implementation and the bottlenecks that people are really experiencing at member states. I think it's great to have the right policy in place, but of course you need to have the legislation there to underpin that. And we would very much be advocating for streamlined processes, one-stop shop for planning, to really address those types of challenges. And I think one other area that I would really like to highlight, it's absolutely crucial, is public support. We need to keep the public on board with this. We need to ensure that everybody wants to flick the switch and turn on the lights. And I think everybody needs to understand where their electricity is coming from and how that's potentially going to need to change. And we absolutely need to engage the public on this and take them with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Elaine. David?
Just to say that, and thank you for organising this, there is a real opportunity here for our country, and we need to do everything we can to embrace it and go forward in a positive way. So that's it. That's the challenge that's there for us.
Thanks very much. Daniel?
We're at day 1 of floating offshore wind globally. Now is the opportunity for us to become a market leader and not fall behind like we did in fixed bottom.
Niall?
Yeah, I think I can only echo a lot of that as well. It's getting the needed systems and policies in place now. You know, these are some of the biggest infrastructural projects that we've ever had in the state. We should treat them like that and make sure that we're getting ourselves aligned, making sure that the policies are there, and make sure we don't have another situation where companies are pulling out because of a lack of certainty. You know, we need to make sure that, the next 12 months is going to be really, really critical to make sure that we're going to deliver that 5 gigawatts. And look, the direction we're heading in at the moment has been positive in recent months. Let's keep the momentum going and make sure we can get there.
Yeah, I think that sums a lot of it up. And I think one last thing to say, I think should not be lost. The development of, let's say, offshore wind, particularly on the West Coast, but equally on the East Coast, it will help parts of their economy that are the weakest and the ones needing most support. So much of everything else we do is sucked towards Dublin and the engine that the Dublin economy is. This is a chance to balance regional development and give the regions an opportunity to develop in the same way as the rest of the country. So just to leave it at that, I'd like to thank our 4 speakers, Elaine O'Connell from the Commission, David Kiley from Jennings O'Donovan and Partners, Daniel Brown from Rowan Group Renewables, and Niall Goodwin from Wind Energy Ireland. I'd particularly also like to thank my colleague Sean Kelly, who has been a great mentor to me for the last 12 months in particular, but and a great knowledge in this particular area, as he is in many others. So I'll leave it at that. And finally, I'd just also like to, to thank my own crew in the background who've done so much work on this over the last week or two, and to all those who engaged with us here today. We had well over 120 or 30 registered, and almost 100 involved all through this. So I'd just like to thank them all for that, and look forward to tune in again. We'll have another one coming up shortly in the new year, and look forward to it. And thank you again, everyone, for their involvement.